I was assigned a topic by your preacher, and I want to say a thank you to George, and that is that God made marriage, and he gave me, along with that, and I didn't really pay attention to my assignment, kind of like when I was in school, that the passage was Matthew 5:27 through 32, where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery," and then he speaks about a man who would look upon a woman, and he says, if you have committed adultery in his heart, you have committed an egregious sin. He goes on there to speak about divorce and shocks his audience that they couldn't just divorce for any reason, but that unless sexual unfaithfulness had occurred, there was no good reason to divorce and to remarry. I'm not going to go into all the finer points of that tonight. You are a Wednesday night crowd. I'm sure most of you are quite studied as Bible students. What I want to do tonight is talk to those of you that are married and those who will be one of these days about how to have the best marriage. When you get right down to it, Jesus, that's what he wanted. He wanted the people that were listening to him to stop arguing and fussing about what you could or couldn't do with your marriage to stay married and to have the best marriage that you could have, to make it work and to stay together. God made marriage. If you're a Christian, that's just theology 101. That's not even a shocking thing to say or a surprising thing to learn, is it? Now, when you look out into the world around us, we see people saying all kinds of things about marriage, but we should not be surprised when the pagan, when the non-believer, when the God-hater, as Paul would call them in Romans chapter 1, does what they wish or want with marriage. Some years ago, the Supreme Court decided that two people of the same sex can get married. I don't care. They can rule whatever they like. They'll face the very God who made marriage someday for that decision. Doesn't change anything. We can call ducks dogs and we can call cats cows, but it doesn't change anything. When you understand the simple truth that God made marriage. When you understand that, then you understand that marriage is what God says it is. It's that simple. But understand that we're coming at this now from the standpoint of a biblical worldview that says God is real, that God made Adam, and that God made Eve. God looked at Adam and said, "It is not good," Genesis 2, "for this man to be alone. I will make," the King James says, "a helpmeet. I will make a mate, a companion for him." Adam needed someone to complete him. And so God looks around, as the text goes, and not that God needed to look around. He's being attributed human characteristics so that we can follow along in the account and we can feel to be a part of it. And there was no one suitable for him. And so he took a rib, as the story goes, or I should say nowadays, so people don't think I mean this in a mythical way. As the account goes, the historical account goes, God took a rib from Adam, and some have said he didn't take it, he didn't take something from up high, and he didn't take something from down low so that they would be on equal footing. And there's probably some truth to that. God didn't need the rib. He didn't need a rib to make Adam, but there is some symbolism here that she comes out of Adam, that she completes Adam. And I think you will find that most men who are in a good marriage will tell you that their wives very much complete them. And so God brings this woman to Adam and he presents her to him. And Adam says, "For this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father." And again, the King James says cleave, and somebody says we've been leaving and cleaving for a really long time. It's true. Marriage is as ancient as human beings are. So when people seek to toy with marriage, they're toying with the kinds of things that you can't toy with, even if you think you can. You don't get to play with it. God designed marriage. God determined what would define marriage. God manages marriage. Marriage is not yours and it's not mine. It is God's. And I suppose I could spend a lot of time tonight talking about the fact that when you enter into the covenant of marriage, there are three members in that covenant. There is you, your spouse, and God. So when we toy with marriage, we are genuinely playing with fire, with God's fire, perhaps for a better way of saying it. You can't just do whatever you want with it. And even if it seems like for a while that people do, there will come a day of reckoning for those that have chosen to toy with the fundamental facts of being a human being that God defined when he made that first man and he made that first woman. And he said, this is how it will be. And Adam said, sounds great to me. And there at the end of Genesis 2, it says they were naked and they were not ashamed. There was an innocence and there was a beauty here in this relationship. So I just say all of that as a bit of an introduction to asking the question, how do you have the best marriage you can have? And I just want to break this down into some simple points tonight, if I can make this work. Can you guys turn it from back there? Did you do that or did I? There we go. You're married. You have a husband, you have a wife. Have you been married a long time? Maybe you've just gotten married. I've been married almost 23 years. Some of you have been married twice that. I know some people that have been married over 70. I know some that just got married. What do you say to everybody? There's a whole room full of people. Y'all have different experiences. Y'all have different spouses. There's all kinds of different personalities. How do you have the best marriage? Well, there's some fundamental things that everybody needs to do. And when Jesus was talking in the Sermon on the Mount, there's an old preacher years ago, long forgotten by most. Some of you, if you know who this is, you're probably you're probably saying something about your age. But there was a preacher years ago. His name was Foy Wallace Jr. And he used to do a sermon. I heard a couple people laughing. I won't point any fingers. But he died in, I think, about 1978, 79, somewhere in there. But he used to do a sermon on the Sermon on the Mount, and he called it Pentecost Pointers. And I thought this was one of the most astute observations of the Sermon on the Mount I'd ever heard. And he said about the Sermon on the Mount, he said, it's not for the world, it's for Christians. This is for people that are going to do what those people did in Acts chapter 2 on Pentecost. These are Pentecost pointers. How are you going to live? How are you going to think about your relationships? See, when Jesus is speaking here to these people, he's speaking to people that are selfish, self-centered. At the time, there was multiple ideas about marriage, and one of the ideas that the rabbis rolled around with was even if you could divorce your wife for anything. And you can go back and you can read in the Jewish Talmud where it says, if she burns your toast, then you can get a new one. And we laugh at that, but think about how callous that is and how terrible that is to just wipe away a relationship because of little things. And so we live in a world that says, well, it's not your fault and it's not my fault. And so we have no fault. And the attorneys come in, and I've sat in the courtrooms. I've sat there next to a person, or I've sat there and I've watched a couple stand before a judge as I was a witness or as I was a comforter. And I've watched that judge declare that they're no longer a couple. And I think to myself, when I've been in those situations, and they're absolutely, genuinely awful, those are the worst days you'll ever be a part of. Everybody in the room is miserable, including the judge. That's a fact. And I think, what are you going to say to God someday, sir? How are you going to explain the fact that you've declared these two people not to be married when he doesn't declare them not to be married? I mean, just because I declare something as a human being doesn't make it true, does it? We can declare all sorts of things. I've heard things declared recently in this world. Did you know that men can become women? And vice versa? I was unaware. I thought you were born, and that's what you were. So the world is mad, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm not trying to run in a rant, but what I want you to see is what we need to do is stick our nose in the Bible and say, I want my marriage to be the very best I can, and I don't care what the world has to say, and I don't care what anybody else thinks about me. What does God have to say? And the first way I need to do that, and we're just going to use the word best tonight, because we want the best, right? I want the best. I want the best I can get. But if I'm going to get the best out of my marriage, see what Jesus wanted in the Sermon on the Mount is he wanted them to put their best in. Stop trying to find a way out and start putting your best in. Stop talking about divorce and let's make it work. Let's make it work. When you look at 1 Corinthians 7, one of the first things when Paul is speaking to the Corinthian church about marriage, the first thing he does is he says, all right, you two want to split up? How about we get back together? He says, be reconciled to one another. I went to preaching school with a gentleman who's now a missionary in Africa. And while we were in school together, he and his wife, who had been separated for 20 years, got back together. And that was one of the most shocking things I've ever been through. It was one of the most moving experiences of my life. They put their marriage back together after 20 years of separation. I wouldn't have even expected that. I didn't know anybody did that. Of course, I was in my 20s at the time. And I'd only been married for a couple of years. So I didn't even know that kind of thing happened. Some of you may have been through that. You've had experiences with kids. But the point is, we want to hold it together and we want to make it the best and we want to hold up marriage. How am I going to have the best marriage? Number one, I'm going to be a blessing to my spouse. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing, Ephesians 1 and 3. That word blessed that's used, that I'm using, that Peter will use in 1 Peter 5, 8 and 9 when he talks about not giving an insult for evil that is received, but a blessing instead, or that Paul uses in Ephesians 1 and 3, it means to speak well of. In Ephesians chapter 1, what Paul says is, let me just speak well of God. Let me just tell you how great God is. Do you like to be around somebody that tells you how terrible you are? We all love that, right? We love when somebody points out everything wrong with us. And what if you do it every day? What if somebody does that every day for you? Tells you what's wrong with you. Tells you what you do wrong. Never, ever compliments you. Never blesses you. Never speaks well of you. I don't know anybody that likes that. I know a lot of people that are beat down because of that. But if I don't like it, one of the first thoughts I need to have is, do I do that? Do I do that? Am I negative a lot? And am I negative towards my wife? Honey, could you do the dishes? Maybe I could just do them. Could you spend less money? Usually money is a huge thing in marriages. Could you take care of the car better or whatever it is? But just constantly, could you do this or could you do that? And never stopping to think about all the things that she does. All the things that I probably have forgotten to speak well of. I think fundamentally, the first thing that makes for the best possible marriage that you can have is to actively and deliberately speak well of one another. Remember that what you say is absorbed by your spouse. Your words matter. The Bible has a lot to say about words. And perhaps along these lines, we ought to remember that there are a lot of times when we would like to say something that we just need to not. Some things need to just not be said. I remember there was a lady when we were in Texas. She's passed now, and I loved her to death. But she had this saying. She would say, sometimes in a Bible class or something, she'd say something that was just didn't need to be said. It was just harsh and unnecessary. But on more than one occasion, she pulled me aside and she had said to the opposite of that. She said, well, it needed to be said. And I thought, no, it didn't need to be said with that tone. And the truth is, it didn't need to be said at all. You just felt like you needed to set everybody in the room straight. How do you talk to your spouse? Have you said anything positive to them this past week? Have you thanked them for what they do? And that doesn't mean husbands are at the feet of their wives, thanking them all the time. Wives, have you done that for your husbands? Do you actively stop and remember that that is at the bedrock of any great relationship, and especially of marriage? I'm going to be a blessing, or I'm going to be a curse in my marriage. That's fact. And the choice is mine. Other ways of being a blessing, well, we know these things, but let me just remind you, do some kind things and do it on purpose. Do some spontaneous things that are kind. Do some small things. As far as I know, women still like flowers. I don't know. I've yet to meet a woman that doesn't like flowers. Now, there may be some different kinds of flowers, and maybe you're that woman. Fellas, buy her some flowers. Ladies, pick his shoes up that he left in the hallway and don't complain about it. You know, I don't know, but don't do it out of duty. Do it because you love them, because you want to give the gift of being a blessing. Be helpful. Show thankfulness and appreciation, and always give thanks. Pray for your spouse and pray together. Call God's favor down on them. And the husband or wife who practices being a blessing, here's the good news, by the way. You're going to find God's blessing on you. You're going to find a lot of peace and happiness in that. Number 2, I still don't know if I did this or they did. How about this? The old word, the King James word, was edifying. But let's just say if I'm going to have the best marriage I can, be encouraging. The word encouraging or the word edify, it means to build up. You know, in the church, I'm trying to edify you with preaching tonight, but I wouldn't advise that in your marriage. Some of you will get that. Conversely, silence does not build anyone up either. And so we want to build up our spouse in every aspect of their personality. You know, part of being married is understanding another person. And you don't understand that other person, I don't think, for quite some time. It takes years. And so people decide to divorce. They decide to separate. The truth is, they don't even know each other. They've not taken the time. But as that time rolls along, we want to cheer our spouse on in every area of life, with work, with the kids, whatever it may be. And I think even as a married person, what worked with us in elementary school works in a marriage. You remember when you're elementary school, you know, your teacher encouraged you and told you that you could do it when you couldn't get the multiplication tables, or maybe in my case, I couldn't write the lowercase letter E to save my life when I was in elementary school. And so my mom's got lots of papers, and there's an L, there's a U, there's a K, and then a backwards E all messed up and turned. This looks like I had a stroke in the middle of the letter. I don't know what happened, but my elementary school teacher, Miss Ragland, she just encouraged me. She said, you can do it. And so in marriage, that's what we need. We need to enlarge one another's worth. The world is there to tear us down. And so edifying is an expanded love. It's expressed in positive ways that enlarge the self-worth of another. And if you do some my wife always messes this up. In college, I took entomology. Does anybody know what entomology is? It's a study of insects. But etymology, see how close those words are, is a study of words. And if you take that word edify and you look at the Latin root of that word, not that anybody's going to go home and spend your time doing this, by the way, I know. It speaks of the idea of the hearth. That word edify, the picture, it's of, well, maybe you have a fireplace in your house. And in the wintertime, you crank that fireplace up. And it's warm and it's inviting. And it's a cozy place to be. That's the word picture of the word edify. Are you a cozy person to be around? That's what God wants you to be in your marriage. He wants you to be somebody that people will come to. He wants you to be a husband or a wife that your spouse wants to be close to. And in all of that, there is encouragement, there is strengthening, and there is peace and harmony. Paul says in Romans chapter 14 and 19 that we would pursue for the thing with or after the things that make for peace, building up one another. And he's talking about the church, by the way, there, but it equally applies to marriage, that we would pursue that which lifts us. How do we edify? By praising our spouses. Praise your husband or praise your wife privately, but also publicly. And the best way to compliment one another is frequently. Edifying or encouraging never tears another individual down. Again, another passage that you could throw in here would be Philippians 4 and 8. Paul's talking about the church and unity in the church, but it equally applies to marriage. If there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, let your mind dwell on those things. And so we want to dwell on those. Forget about, what do we mean? Anything excellent, anything worthy of praise, dwell on those things. There's a lot of things in a married relationship you can dwell on, right? Hurts, slights, wrongs. You can dwell on those. Insults, when we don't get our own way. And what Paul says is don't. Let those things go. Forgive and forget. And remember how to encourage and lift up one another. Number 3, if you want to have the best marriage you can, you're going to have to be selfless. You're going to have to learn to share. That's what marriage is, isn't it? God looked at Adam and he said, you need to share your life with somebody. It's not going to work very well if it's just you. And so you have a shared life. And God would say, well, then share everything else. How do you do that, though? There's a word that gets caught up in here, or that needs to be mentioned. If I'm going to really share my life with another person, I got to trust them. I really have to trust them. That means nobody's running up bills on credit cards behind somebody else's back. If you're in ministry long enough, you'll have conversations with married couples where, he's pulling the arm on the, what do they call those things, the slot machines, and using their savings to do that. Or, she's running around with the girls and eating in the fancy restaurants. And the bottom line is that they're both doing stuff behind each other's backs, and there's no trust. They can't trust each other. And because they can't trust, the selflessness is filled up with selfishness. And that marriage isn't going to make it. Doesn't matter what I want or what their parents want or what their kids want. It's not going to make it. Because if the trust isn't there, eventually that selfishness is going to shatter that marriage. And so I'm going to have to ask a very simple question in my marriage if I want it to last and be the best that it can be. If that's really what I want, can my spouse trust me? Can they trust me? Am I deceptive? Or am I open? Am I honest? I saw a cartoon If I hadn't been quite so lazy, I'd have put it on the board for you. But there's a man and a woman, they're standing at the altar, and the preacher is there, and of course the preacher's talking to the groom, do you take this woman? And the groom says, I do. And the bride turns around, looks at him and says, this isn't about you, it's about me. And the preacher says, uh-oh, we got trouble. Selfishness, egotism, self-absorption, it kills relationships. Simple as that. You want to have a great marriage, you're going to have to think about your spouse more than you think about yourself, and it has to come from both sides. Several years ago, my wife was the receptionist at the Holiday Inn in Russellville. Matter of fact, when we met, she worked behind the desk in there. And we were in there one evening, and a gentleman came in, and he was well up in years, but he and his wife were just carrying on. And my wife, well, she wasn't my wife then, but we were dating, and she could not help but notice, and I noticed, just how playful these two were with one another. And they were probably in their late 80s. I mean, they were well up in years. And my wife, just said, how long have you been married? And it was something like 65 years or something. I don't remember. It was over 60 years. I remember that. And she said, well, how did you do it? And you've heard this, but it was interesting to hear him say it. He just simply said it's not a 50-50 proposition. It's a 100% proposition. We're not each given half. We're both given all. And that's been said 1,000,000 times in sermons. But it's still as relevant as the first time it was ever said. That's what God wanted Adam and Eve to do. And the two, Adam said, will become one flesh. This mystery is great, Paul would later say. That's giving 100%. And let me just finish with this. How do you have the best marriage? Number 4, be touching. Sex is an important part of marriage. Sex is a wonderful part of marriage. But I mean even beyond the sexual. I mean simply touching. Human beings are not made to just be left alone. There is a need for affection. And it is that non-sexual touching that fertilizes and nourishes relationships. The largest and most sensual, or sensitive, I guess would be the word, not sensual. Maybe that's the right word. The biggest organ you got, how's that? Is what? It's your skin, isn't it? And a hug, a caress, a kiss. These are all things that when we're children mean so much to us. And every year that passes, they mean even more. God created us with hundreds and thousands of microscopic nerve endings in our skin. And that is for the benefit of a loving touch. There's a story in Matthew 8 that'll just bring a tear to your eye. There was a man with leprosy. And he came and he knelt before Jesus and he said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And no one had touched him. No one would touch him. He was a leper. And then in verse 3 there in Matthew 8, it just reads, matter-of-factly, Jesus reached a hand out and touched him. And that meant more than anything else could have to him. And he said, I'm willing, be clean. And immediately he was cured. There was power in the touch, a tender touch. Tells us we're cared for. Tells us that we're loved. It calms our fears. It soothes our pain. It brings comfort. It brings satisfaction. It brings emotional security. I've had, several years ago, my wife decided we needed a boxer dog. I don't know anything about dogs. I always had whatever showed up at our house when we were kids. We lived out in the country, and so whatever showed up or people dumped out, we raised. Anyway, so my wife says, we got to get this boxer. And I said, all right, well, where do you want to get one? And she looked around and she said, well, there's one of these rescue shelters up in Houston. I said, okay, I don't know anything about any of this. And so we got in my truck and we went up to this rescue shelter. And I should have known that I was in a lot of trouble, because as they were trying to put this dog into my truck, it bolted and ran about 6 blocks down the street. And this was my relationship with this dog for about the next year. If you moved in the house, if you scooted a chair, it would try to run through the wall. And the reason is it had been so severely abused. It was the most insecure creature I've ever been around, and it died in our backyard one day, and I wasn't sorry. And what I mean by that is I felt so sorry for it that I was kind of glad. It was just so damaged. And we need to remember how we touch people, how we interact, determines the kind of emotional security we have or that we don't have. And that's from touch, and that's from words. And we need that in a marriage. It must be there. And so finally, let me just put the finishing touches on this. In Ephesians 2:29, it says, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building up others, according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ forgave you." I know somebody will say, well, he means that in regard to the church. But those words in Ephesians 2 are very fitting to marriage. And so I hope you'll recommit yourself to your marriage. And if you're not married tonight and you're engaged, or you will be someday, that what you will do in that relationship is seek to make it the very best you can. And the only way you can do that is if you let God guide your hand and your mind and your soul in that relationship. And tonight we have not preached the gospel, but if there is anybody here tonight that needs anything from this congregation, from putting on Jesus in baptism or